When you think about iconic video game developers, I'm sure your mind probably jumps to a few companies, like EA, Ubisoft, or Rockstar. But back in the 90s, one of the biggest game developers was Rareware. They made classic after classic, from Donkey Kong Country to Perfect Dark. But at the turn of the century, they were bought by Microsoft to only make exclusive Xbox games. And from then on, their games were pretty hit or miss. Got by the Ghoulies was a good, but it was nothing special. Perfect Dark Zero was a train wreck of a game. And eventually Microsoft kind of abandoned Rareware, and delegated them to just making sports games for the Kinect. You know, that Xbox 360 add-on that kinda sucked and wasn't very good in any way at all.
You've got to put these goggles on.
Goggles? Notice what she did. This wasn't acted. She felt the need to reach down for those goggles.
And then after that, they kinda disappeared for a while, until they announced Rare Replay, which was a collection of all their past games. Or at least the ones they had the rights to. And then at E3 2015, we got a glimpse of what their next project was. The trailer was pretty simple and short, but showed some pretty heated fights, some beautiful graphics, and promised a whole new world to explore in a game called Sea of Thieves. A full-fledged open-world pirate game set in the golden age of pirating. Then after a few more years of trailers and a few delays, the game came out on March 20th, 2018, to not such a great reception. Everything that the trailer promised came to fruition, except it was just boring. Clearly what they released was a rushed version of what they had originally envisioned. And since it's now 2022, and the game has evolved so much from that original launch version, I think it's now the best time to compare the launch Sea of Thieves to the current version in 2022. Now, real quick before this video starts, I just want to say that it'd mean a lot to me if you'd like the video and subscribe, because if you didn't notice, I don't have that many subscribers. So it's a good time now to get on the ground floor, wink wink. Okay. I don't want to bore you for too long now, so I'll go ahead and get back to the video. So if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume that you know and understand at least a little bit of what the game is all about, and if you don't, it's pretty simple. You're a pirate just doing pirate things, such as killing skeletons, digging up treasure, and killing other pirates for the sake of a quick buck. And while the launch game had all of these features, it was still very empty. And to understand why, we need to start with the combat. As combat is one of the main things that you'll encounter on your voyages across the sea, and it can lead to your success or failure. Now when I think of Sea of Thieves combat, I think of two completely different types of combat, on foot and ship combat. I'm going to start with the on foot combat because I think it's possibly one of the least changed things from the game. Now, when the game launched, there was 4 main weapons to choose from. These weapons were Flintlock, a pistol type weapon with a medium range and a pretty fast reload, but it's the weakest gun in the game. The Blunderbuss, it's a good shotgun type weapon that doesn't have much range, but up close, it can be a really powerful weapon. A weapon called the Eye of Reach, which is a sniper that hits really hard and goes really far, but it takes a while to reload. And of course there's the classic sword with a 3-swing combo and a charge attack. It does decent damage, and if used correctly, the charge attack can be a good mobility option, but it can only hit people right in front of you, obviously. Now, each of these weapons, of course, had different versions you could get, but they were just for visual differences. They didn't add any extra gameplay or anything, all aesthetic purposes. And other than that, those 4 weapons are still the only main weapons that you can choose from in the game. But of course, since then, they've added more ways to attack your opponents with the addition of 2 bomb-type weapons. One being the Blunderbomb, which is a bomb that you can throw at opponents, and when it hits them, it'll hurt them and knock them away from wherever they were standing. And the other is a firebomb, which is a bomb full of, you guessed it, fire. And when you throw it, it will light whatever is in the vicinity of it, including other pirates and AI, on fire, dealing them damage over time. I think it's a good thing that they didn't bloat the fighting with a bunch of new weapons and kept it simple and easy for people to pick up and play. And I think the 2 new bombs they added are a good addition, and I see people using them pretty regularly. Now, most of the time, if you're on foot, you're going to be fighting AI, and if you're going to be fighting other pirates, you'd probably want to be on your ship, which is what I'll talk about next. Ship combat. Unlike on-foot combat, ship combat has changed drastically since launch. At launch, all you could really do was shoot cannonballs, shoot yourself out of cannons, and fix holes from the other ships that shot you. There was no skeleton ships, ghost ships, megalodons, or anything like that. There was a kraken that you could fight though, although it was very bare bones and it didn't drop any loot, but back then that's all I ever really expected from it. Now it's much more in depth. Since then they've added so many things that change and improve the combat. One of the first things they introduced were the cursed cannonballs. They're cannonballs that don't deal any damage to other ships, but do affect them in ways like making them go to sleep or raising their sails. If you hit another ship, it can drastically change the whole course of the battle and it can help you out a ton. Although, I've been on the receiving end plenty of times, and I have to say, I don't like being on the receiving end. Other than that, I think they're a great addition. But along with those, they introduced the skeleton ship, which, it's a ship manned by, you guessed it, skeletons, and they fight relentlessly, but can be taken down if you try hard enough. There's also ghost ships, which are kinda similar to skeleton ships, just weaker and usually come in big groups. Another thing they added to ship combat was having more items be destructible. Like I said, when the game launched, ships could only get holes in the sides of them, and that was all. But eventually, the wheel, capstan, and mast all became destructible objects, needing to be repaired if they're hit. Another new cannonball variety they introduced are the chain shots. Shoot these bad boys at a ship mast and it'll take them down effectively, stopping them in their tracks. And with the introduction of blunderbombs and firebombs, they also made the ships able to catch fire. Now when these firebombs hit another ship, it'll catch it on fire and it'll need to be put out with a bucket of water, which added one more complication in the heat of battle. But what's the point of all this battling if there's no enemies to battle? Exactly. Nothing. So now I'll cover all the new enemy varieties. When the game launched, it was very limited. There were a few skeleton varieties, sharks, and other pirates. The different types of skeletons added variety in combat, but not really enough to get engaged in it. On top of those was the kraken, which, while being a challenge, there was nothing for killing it at all. So it was pretty much a fruitless battle. And other pirates were clearly a more competent fight, and you never knew exactly what they would do. Nowadays, there's way more enemies, and the kraken actually drops loot. Of course, there's the classic skeletons and sharks, but now there's sirens, phantoms, and 3 ocean crawlers. The sirens are insanely annoying, with projectiles, but luckily since they're mermaids they can't get out of the water. The phantoms are just ghosts, and they can be a little annoying since they have a teleport ability, but they can be taken care of pretty easily. Then there's the 3 ocean crawlers, my least favorite. The crab is probably my least hated of the 3 though. He's big but slow, and he only has one move. He can slam his hand into the ground, which deals a lot of damage, but if you're just not next to him, you should be fine. He can also turn into a ball and shield himself and the other ocean crawlers. But other than that, he's a pretty fine enemy. He does take 5 shots to kill though, but I'll talk about why that's an issue in a minute. And then there's the clam. He can be a bit annoying with his toxic gas that he spews out, but he's a pretty easy enemy to defeat, and he has no range other than his charge ability. Then there's my least favorite, the eel lady. Her thing is, she's electric, so if you hit her with a sword, you get electrocuted. Her main move is shooting an electric orb at you, and she can dash away from or to you insanely fast. Now why I dislike her goes for about all of the ocean crawlers. They discourage using the sword, which usually wouldn't be such a big problem. It's fun to experiment with new weapons. But when they don't drop ammo, and the crab himself takes all of your ammo to defeat, it can be a little bit annoying, but it does add a challenge. And of course, they added the megalodons too, which is a nice fight. Overall, they've added plenty of new enemies, even if they're not all my favorites. Another huge change are the changes to the world. When the game launched, there was 3 distinct areas of the world: the Shores of Plenty, the Ancient Isles, and the Wilds. The Shores of Plenty was a very calm area, with calm and pretty blue water, beautiful islands, and shallow shores. The Ancient Isles were also pretty calm, but had more height with more rocky mountains and more caves. And the Wilds had rougher, darker waters with a darker sky and very rocky and dangerous islands. But jump to today, and while there's still all of these things, there's been changes and additions. The Devil's Roar was added, which is a whole new section of the map full of volcanoes and boiling hot water. It's a really dangerous place that people usually don't go to, either out of fear or annoyance, but either way it adds a nice bit of challenge if you want it. Along with the whole new portion of the map, there's been new additions like the sea forts and the mermaid shrines. The forts are used mainly for fighting phantoms and collecting loot, But as I'm writing this, they're being used in an adventure, which I'll touch on later, but other than that, they don't have much usage in the game. And the mermaid shrines are temples far underneath the waves, and are mostly for, once again, collecting loot and fighting, but this time it's fighting against sirens instead of phantoms. Other than that, the overall map hasn't changed much other than the Reaper's hideout, but to explain that, I have to talk about the trading companies. So since in Sea of Thieves, your main objective is to make money and become a pirate legend, you can go about that in a few ways, and the ways that Rare wants you to go about doing that are voyages, and voyages come from trading companies. When the game launched, there was 3 trading companies. The Merchant Alliance, who would have you taking animals to people on other islands, the Gold Hoarders, who would send you to dig up treasure, and the Order of the Souls, that would send you to go fight skeletons and bring back their skulls. And just having those 3 was a bit repetitive. There was only so much you could do with those. Granted, you would occasionally find messages in bottles, sitting out on the beach, but those are really hit or miss too. But now there's way more variety, and those trading companies are still around, with old and new voyages. For example, the Merchant Alliance can still have you delivering animals, but they may also have you delivering bottles, cloths, plants, storage crates, and more. And you may think that it wouldn't change very much, but each item brings a different complication, like not breaking the bottles, or not letting the cloth get wet. The Gold Hoarder missions are largely the same, but his were never much of an issue. And the Order of the Souls got ghost ship battles, where you fight a fleet of ghost ships, and get all their skulls and loot. There's also 2 new trading companies added, the Hunter's Call and the Reaper's Bones. The Hunter's Call are located at sea posts, and they take fish. That's all. They're pretty hard to level up, but with enough work, I'm sure you could get it all done. And the Reaper's Bones are located at the Reaper's hideout, and they will take anything from you, but they love emissary flags. To explain emissary flags, I have to go back to the other trading companies. When you choose to do a voyage for a company, you have the option of raising an emissary flag, which will grant you more gold for selling things to a specific company. But of course it can't just be that easy to get more money. When you have an emissary flag, it immediately puts a target on your back. You're marked with a giant flag that when traded into the Reaper's Bones, it will grant tons of money. But the only way to get that flag is for someone to sink your ship. Now Reaper's Bones also has an emissary flag, but it has a twist. When you raise it, everyone on the map can see where your ship is at all times. But once it reaches the top level of emissary flag, by getting loot on your ship, you can see where all the other emissaries are on the whole map, marking them even more of a target. Which is yet another addition to the game since launch, and I think it's a great addition, adding a sort of risk and reward thing to encourage more fights, since a lot of people tend to not want to fight nowadays, is just a great idea. And yes, I know I didn't talk about Athena's Fortune, but I'm not a pirate legend, so I don't know enough about what they do to really talk about it. At launch, there was no type of story mode, and you were just left to guess the lore of the world to an extent by talking to NPCs and looking at the drawings and writings on rocks found around the island, which was very disappointing and left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths at launch. But thankfully, after a year of the game being out, they finally released a pseudo-story mode titled Tall Tales. It was 9 story-driven voyages that would send you all over the sea to do a ton of different quests and objectives, all leading up to a big final battle. It was an amazing addition to the game and added a much-needed story as well as some decently challenging puzzles. After that, there was a few more added here and there, but eventually they stopped coming out. Then out of the blue in 2021, Rare announced a new set of Tall Tales based off the ever-popular Pirates of the Caribbean. And these took a much more linear approach to the Tall Tales format, but they were still amazing and added even more incentive to play the game. After that, in the second half of 2021, Rare announced that they would start doing stories in limited time events called Adventures. And as of the time of me writing this, they've stuck by this and they release them pretty frequently. I think most people agree that Tall Tales were a better option, but some of the new adventures can be influenced by a player choice, which, while it would have been possible to do with the old format, it would have been much more difficult. Either way, what we have now is leagues better than what we had at the game at launch at least. But one thing that was fine with the game at launch were the cosmetics. I'm not saying the cosmetics make up for everything else in the game missing, but they did get me excited to play and kept me coming back so I could just purchase new clothes. And of course, since launch, they've added new cosmetics pretty frequently, but unfortunately, they've also added microtransactions. On their own, microtransactions aren't that bad. And in Sea of Thieves, they're done quite tastefully too, which everything that you can buy is just cosmetic, like new clothes, emotes, ship sets, and even pets. Which, I gotta admit, I did splurge to get a cat named Hag. But it takes away from the free items. These two things can coexist, and they do to an extent. It's just that the premium currency store gets updated way more regularly than the one that's used to buy from within the game currency. Which wouldn't be so bad if it didn't just so happen to be the only things that you can buy in the game currency is either voyages or cosmetics. And so if there's not much added that you want to buy, then it kind of gives you no reason to get any gold in the game, and if you don't want to get any gold, then why are you playing? Maybe just to kill people, but other than that, I don't see much of a reason. Now, I understand needing a premium currency shop in the game. It's a live service game after all, and it does need to constantly make money to keep updating. But there has to be a solution to the issue. But if you don't mind paying a little extra for some really cool stuff, then the cosmetics are way better now than they were at launch. So a few things that I wasn't quite sure where to put in, I'm just going to put here and label it as the miscellaneous. One new thing they added were seasons, where every few months Rare releases a new season and it comes with new cosmetics, mechanics, and sometimes even new places. Each season has its own plunder pass, which if you don't know what that is, it's pretty much just a battle pass but for the Sea of Thieves. There's of course a free and premium version, with the premium version having all the best things in it, but the free one has some pretty good stuff as well, at least to me. But some of the smaller changes that those seasons can bring are things like fireworks, which just add more fun to the game, as well as other just quality of life changes. And over the years, there's been a few pretty big changes to the ships overall. With the game first being launched, you would choose to sail a ship designed for either 4 people or 1 to 2, being either a galleon or a sloop. But after, they introduced a new ship for 3 people specifically, the Brigantine. And the Brigantine is pretty loved within the community. And pretty recently, they've added an option to buy a ship permanently to captain it. And when you buy a ship, you pay a pretty decent amount of money and you get to name your ship. Once it's named, when someone walks up to it or looks at it from afar through a telescope, it'll tell them the name of the ship as well as who's captaining it. On top of that, you get to customize the interior of the ship to your liking. Unfortunately, a lot of the customization is pretty limited unless you're on a galleon type ship, but it's still nice regardless. And you can choose to save these items to the ship, which, once again, does cost gold, but it makes it much easier so that you don't have to apply it every time that you get on to play. And I think I've finally covered just about every major change from the Sea of Thieves from its launch to now. And man, it's really come a long way. Although this game is far from perfect, it's much better than it was just a few years ago. And it's clear that people at Rare still really care about the game and are constantly trying to better the game and breathe new life into it. And I admire it, no matter how much they end up messing it up sometimes. Because at the end of the day, no matter how you try to spin it, this game is so much better than it was in 2018 when it launched. So if you haven't, I think the game is 100% worth trying out. Especially if you already have Game Pass. Or even if you tried it out years ago and you were let down by how empty it felt, I definitely say you should try it again, because it's not the same game that it was all those years ago. Now, of course, if you liked the video and you want to see more, make sure to leave a like, comment, and if you don't mind, subscribe. And I'll see you all in the next one.